She took the job everyone rejected at the cold billionaire's house and lived the sweetest days of her life. Her worn sneakers crunched against the marble steps of the Whitmore Estate, and as Amara clutched the crumpled job posting that bore a dozen rejection stamps, she whispered a prayer that desperation might finally be her salvation. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story, because tomorrow I have another beautiful story to share with you, and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now, let's get into the story. The morning mist clung to the wrought-iron gates of the Whitmore Estate like a shroud, and Amara Washington stood before them with nothing but $23 in her purse and a determination born from rock bottom. The job posting in her trembling hands had been passed around the employment agency so many times that the edges were soft as cloth, each crease marking another person who'd walked away. Private household staff position. Whitmore Estate. Immediate start. Competitive salary. What the posting didn't mention, what everyone whispered about in the waiting rooms, was why the position had been open for 8 months. Nobody lasts more than a week, Mrs. Henderson from the agency had warned, her glasses sliding down her nose as she reluctantly handed over the address. Harrison Whitmore is difficult. The last girl quit mid-shift. Didn't even collect her first day's pay. But Amara hadn't come this far to be scared off by whispers. Not when her landlord's eviction notice was taped to her apartment door. Not when her last can of soup sat empty in the trash. Not when her nursing school dreams hung by a thread, so thin it might snap with her next breath. What would you do if you were desperate enough to take a job everyone warned you about? Share your thoughts below. Have you ever had to make a choice between pride and survival? The intercom buzzed with mechanical indifference when she pressed the button. A crisp, elderly voice crackled through. State your business. Amara Washington. I'm here about the household position. Silence stretched like a held breath. Then, walk to the main entrance. Do not touch anything. The wrought-iron gates swung open with a whisper, revealing a cobblestone driveway that curved like a question mark through manicured gardens. Amara's breath caught in her throat. She'd cleaned houses before, modest suburban homes where she'd scrubbed toilets for $15 an hour. But this wasn't a house. This was a monument to wealth that stretched across the Virginia hillside like a sleeping giant. Marble columns rose 3 stories high, supporting balconies where ivy cascaded in perfect symmetry. Every window gleamed like a diamond, reflecting the morning sun in sharp bursts of light that made her squint. The gardens weren't just landscaped. They were sculpted, each rose bush positioned with mathematical precision, each fountain gurgling in harmony with its neighbors. Her worn sneakers felt like betrayal against the pristine walkway. Every step announced her inadequacy, the rubber soles squeaking against stone that probably cost more per square foot than her monthly rent. She pulled her threadbare coat tighter, suddenly conscious of the hole near her left elbow and the way her jeans had faded to the color of old dishwater. The massive oak doors opened before she could knock, revealing a woman in her 70s with silver hair pulled into a perfect chignon. Her navy blue suit was immaculate, adorned with a small pearl brooch that caught the light. Mrs. Whitmore? Amara ventured. Mrs. Caldwell, head of household staff. The woman's eyes swept over Amara with surgical precision, cataloging every flaw. You're the 4th applicant this month. The others didn't make it past the interview. Inside, the foyer soared 40 feet overhead, dominated by a crystal chandelier that could have housed a small family. Amara's reflection multiplied in the polished marble floor, an army of inadequate versions of herself stretching into infinity. Oil paintings in gilded frames lined the walls. Ancestors, she supposed, their painted eyes following her progress with aristocratic disdain. Mr. Whitmore is conducting business, Mrs. Caldwell announced, her heels clicking against the marble in staccato rhythm. You'll wait in the morning room. Do not touch anything. Do not sit unless invited. Do not speak unless spoken to. The morning room was larger than Amara's entire apartment. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the estate's rear gardens, where a maze of hedges created intricate patterns around a central fountain. Antique furniture was arranged with museum-like precision, each piece probably worth more than she'd earn in a year. Amara stood in the center of the room like a statue, afraid to move, afraid to breathe too loudly. Her stomach chose that moment to growl, a reminder that she'd skipped breakfast because her refrigerator contained only condiments and expired milk. She pressed her hand against her abdomen, willing it to silence. From somewhere deeper in the house came the sound of a door slamming, followed by muffled voices. One voice rose above the others, sharp, commanding, edged with irritation. Even through the walls, the authority in that voice made her spine straighten involuntarily. "Told you I don't want to be disturbed during the Nakamura call. I don't care if the governor himself is at the door." The voice faded as footsteps echoed down a distant hallway, but its impact lingered in the air like the crack of thunder. This was Harrison Whitmore, the man whose very name made employment agencies cringe and former employees change the subject. 30 minutes passed. Then 45. Amara's feet began to ache in her cheap shoes, but she didn't dare sit on the cream-colored settee that probably cost more than her car. She studied the paintings instead, trying to distract herself from the growing certainty that this was a mistake. She'd researched Harrison Whitmore before coming here, spending precious internet cafe dollars to dig through articles and business journals. 34 years old. CEO of Whitmore Holdings, a real estate empire worth 9 figures. Featured on magazine covers with headlines like "The Ice King of Virginia" and "America's Most Ruthless Young Executive." In every photograph, his jaw was set like granite, his grey eyes cold as winter skies. The business articles painted him as brilliant but merciless, a man who'd bought and sold companies like chess pieces, who'd never met a negotiation he couldn't win or a competitor he couldn't crush. But it was the society pages that had truly chilled her blood. Whitmore's latest romance ends in tears. Another socialite bites the dust. Why can't Virginia's richest bachelor keep a woman? Each headline told the same story. Harrison Whitmore was beautiful, wealthy, and utterly incapable of human connection. Yet here she stood, gambling her last hope on the possibility that a man who collected and discarded people like vintage wine might somehow be different with his employees. The desperation felt heavy in her chest, a weight that made breathing difficult. A grandfather clock in the corner chimed 11 times, each note echoing through the room like a judgment. Amara closed her eyes and let herself remember why she was here. The acceptance letter to nursing school, carefully folded in her wallet next to the overdue bills. The dream of wearing scrubs instead of a maid's uniform, of healing instead of cleaning up after other people's messes. The promise she'd made to her grandmother before the cancer took her. "I'm going to be something, Nana. I'm going to help people." She was so lost in memory that she didn't hear the footsteps in the hallway until they stopped just outside the morning room. The door opened without ceremony, and Harrison Whitmore stepped inside like a storm front. He was taller than the photograph suggested, well over 6 feet, with the kind of presence that seemed to compress the air in the room. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his charcoal suit fitted with precision that spoke of expensive tailors. But it was his eyes that stopped her breath. Grey as storm clouds, sharp as surgical steel, and currently fixed on her with an intensity that made her feel like a specimen under a microscope. For a moment, neither of them spoke. He studied her with the same expression she'd seen in his business photos, calculating, measuring, finding her lacking. His gaze swept from her worn shoes to her faded coat, cataloguing every sign of her poverty with clinical detachment. "You're still here," he said finally. His voice was like his appearance, controlled, precise, with an underlying chill that seemed to lower the room's temperature. "Mrs. Caldwell said you've been waiting over an hour." "Yes, sir." Her voice came out smaller than she'd intended, barely above a whisper. Most people would have left by now, claimed they had another appointment, or suddenly remembered somewhere else they needed to be. He moved closer, each step deliberate and measured. "What makes you different?" The question hung in the air between them like a test. Amara felt the weight of the moment. This was her interview, right here, right now. She could give him the answer he expected, humble and grateful and desperate. Or she could tell him the truth. "I don't have anywhere else to go," she said, lifting her chin to meet his gaze. And I don't have the luxury of pride anymore. Something flickered in those grey eyes, surprise, perhaps, or interest. But it was gone so quickly she might have imagined it. Mrs. Caldwell will show you to your quarters, he said, turning toward the door. You start tomorrow at 6. Don't disappoint me, Miss Washington. I don't give second chances. He was halfway to the door when she found her voice again. Mr. Whitmore? What exactly will I be doing? He paused, his hand on the doorframe, and looked back at her with an expression she couldn't read. Whatever I tell you to do, he said. And I should warn you, I'm told I'm impossible to please. Then he was gone, leaving only the faint scent of expensive cologne and the echo of his words in the morning light. Amara stood alone in the magnificent room, her heart hammering against her ribs. She'd gotten the job that everyone else had rejected, that had broken stronger people than her. She should have felt victorious. Instead, she felt like she'd just signed a contract with the devil himself. But as Mrs. Caldwell appeared in the doorway to escort her to the servants' quarters, Amara Washington squared her shoulders and followed. She'd survived worse than Harrison Whitmore. At least, she hoped she had. Amara's alarm clock screamed at 5:30 a.m., jolting her from restless sleep in the servants' quarters, a modest but clean room tucked away in the estate's east wing. She'd barely slept, her mind churning through 100 scenarios of what her first day might bring. Now, standing before the small mirror above her dresser, she smoothed down her one good blouse and tried to look like someone who belonged in Harrison Whitmore's world. Mrs. Caldwell had left a detailed schedule on her nightstand, typed with military precision. 6 a.m., kitchen prep assistance. 7 a.m., breakfast service. 8 a.m., library organization. 10 a.m., correspondence filing. 12 p.m., lunch service. 1 p.m., estate maintenance rounds. 3 p.m., afternoon tea preparation. 4 p.m., personal errands as assigned. 6 p.m., dinner service. 8 p.m., evening duties as required. The list went on, covering 14 hours with the kind of detail that suggested previous staff had needed extensive guidance. At the bottom, a handwritten note in Mrs. Caldwell's precise script. Mr. Whitmore takes his coffee black, no sugar. His newspapers must be pressed and arranged by publication date. He does not repeat instructions. The kitchen was a cathedral of stainless steel and marble, large enough to serve a small restaurant. Maria, the head cook, barely looked up from her prep work when Amara entered. You're the new girl, Maria said in accented English, her knife never pausing as she diced vegetables with mechanical precision. I give you 3 days. Why 3 days? Maria's laugh held no humor. That's how long the last one made it. The one before her? 2 days. The one before that. She shrugged. Didn't even finish her first shift. The coffee service was Amara's first test. The beans had to be ground fresh, the water heated to exactly 185 degrees, the cup warmed beforehand. Mrs. Caldwell demonstrated once, her movements precise as a surgeon's. Mr. Whitmore has his breakfast at exactly 7, she explained. The morning paper, the Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, and the Washington Post must be pressed flat and stacked in that order. The coffee goes on the right side of his place setting. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not linger. Do not make eye contact unless he addresses you directly. At 7 a.m. sharp, Amara carried the silver tray through the marble corridors to the breakfast room. Her hands trembled slightly, making the fine china rattle almost imperceptibly. Through the tall windows, she could see Harrison Whitmore seated at the head of a table that could easily accommodate 12 people. Even in repose, he commanded the space, his posture straight, his attention focused on a tablet displaying what looked like financial charts. Your coffee, sir, she said softly, setting the cup precisely where Mrs. Caldwell had instructed. He didn't look up, didn't acknowledge her presence beyond a slight nod. She might have been invisible, a ghost serving phantoms. The dismissal stung more than she'd expected. As she turned to leave, his voice stopped her. The temperature is wrong. Amara froze. Sir, the coffee. It's too hot. His grey eyes finally lifted to meet hers, and she felt pinned like a butterfly to a board. I assume you followed Mrs. Caldwell's instructions to the letter? Yes, sir. 185 degrees, exactly as. 185 degrees is what she tells everyone. His tone was clinical, detached. I prefer 175. The beans are Jamaican Blue Mountain. Heating them above 175 destroys the subtle flavor notes. I would have thought that was obvious. Heat flooded Amara's cheeks. I'm sorry, sir. I'll remember for tomorrow. Will you? He leaned back in his chair, studying her with the same intensity he'd probably applied to hostile corporate takeovers. The last 3 people who held your position all assured me they would remember for tomorrow. None of them lasted long enough to get a second chance. The cruelty was casual, delivered with the same tone he might use to comment on the weather. Amara felt something hard and hot rise in her chest. Anger, or maybe just exhaustion with being treated like she was disposable. Then maybe, she said, her voice steadier than she felt, you should have mentioned your actual preferences instead of letting me follow instructions that you knew were wrong. The silence that followed was deafening. Harrison Whitmore's eyebrows rose fractionally, the first genuine expression she'd seen from him. Mrs. Caldwell, who had appeared in the doorway to check on the service, looked like she might faint. For a moment, Amara thought he might fire her on the spot. The rational part of her mind was already composing an apology, preparing to grovel for a second chance she probably didn't deserve. But something in his eyes, a flicker of what might have been amusement, kept her silent. Interesting, he said finally. Make my coffee again. 175 degrees this time. It wasn't until she was back in the kitchen, hands shaking as she adjusted the water temperature, that Amara realized what had just happened. She'd challenged Harrison Whitmore, the man who made Fortune 500 CEOs break into cold sweats, and lived to tell about it. Dios mio, Maria whispered, crossing herself. You spoke back to him? I think I might have just made the biggest mistake of my life, Amara replied, watching the thermometer climb toward 175 degrees. But when she returned with the corrected coffee, Harrison accepted it with something that might have been the ghost of a smile. The days that followed revealed the intricate cruelty of Harrison Whitmore's expectations. He demanded perfection in everything, from the precise angle of his newspapers to the thread count of his bed linens. But the rules changed without notice, and failure was met with the kind of cold disappointment that cut deeper than shouting ever could. On Tuesday, he criticized the way she arranged flowers in his study. Too symmetrical, he said, lacking organic flow. On Wednesday, when she attempted a more natural arrangement, he declared it chaotic and unprofessional. Thursday brought complaints about the soap in his bathroom, too floral. Friday, the replacement was too masculine. Each criticism was delivered in the same measured tone, as if he were commenting on stock prices, rather than systematically dismantling her confidence. Amara began to understand why his previous staff had fled. This wasn't just about high standards. This was psychological warfare disguised as employment. But she noticed other things too. The way his jaw tightened when he thought no one was watching. The prescription bottles hidden behind law books in his study. Antacids and sleep aids that suggested his perfect life came with a price. The fact that his phone rarely rang with personal calls, only business associates with voices sharp as broken glass. Most telling of all was his study, a room that Mrs. Caldwell had explicitly forbidden her to enter, but which she glimpsed through the partially open door when delivering afternoon tea. The space was immaculate like the rest of the house, but something about it felt different, more personal. On the massive oak desk sat a single photograph, turned face down as if the image it contained was too painful to look at. Have you ever worked for someone who seemed impossible to please? What do you think drives people to be so demanding? Fear, perfectionism, or something deeper? Share your experiences below. It was during her second week that everything changed. Amara was organizing his extensive library, first by author, then by publication date, then by topic when he changed his mind again, when she heard the crash. The sound of glass shattering echoed through the house, followed by a string of curses that would have made a sailor blush. She found him in his study, standing amid the ruins of what had once been an expensive crystal decanter. Whiskey pooled across the Persian rug like spilled blood, and his hands, those perfectly manicured hands that signed multi-million-dollar deals, were trembling. "Sir." She stood in the doorway, uncertain whether to enter or flee. He looked up at her, and for just a moment his mask slipped. The cold composure cracked, revealing something raw and desperate underneath. Pain, she realized. The kind of deep, bone-deep pain that no amount of money could heal. "I didn't call for you," he said, but his voice lacked its usual edge. "I heard the noise. I thought you might be hurt." "I'm fine." He bent to pick up the larger pieces of crystal, his movements sharp and angry. "Leave me alone." But as he straightened, one of the glass shards sliced across his palm. Blood welled up, bright red against his pale skin, and he hissed in pain. "You're bleeding," Amara said, stepping into the room without invitation. "I said leave me." "No." The word came out firmer than she'd intended. "You're hurt, and I'm not leaving you to bleed all over your fancy rug." She moved closer, pulling a clean tissue from her pocket. Harrison stared at her as if she'd grown a second head, clearly unaccustomed to anyone defying his direct orders. When she reached for his hand, he didn't pull away. His skin was warmer than she'd expected, softer too. These were the hands of a man who'd never done manual labor, never known the rough calluses that came from real work. The cut wasn't deep, but it was bleeding steadily, drops falling onto the whiskey-soaked carpet like tears. "You should run cold water over it," she said, wrapping the tissue around his palm. "And you'll need antiseptic. Cuts from crystal can be tricky. The glass is so sharp it leaves almost no debris, but the edges can be contaminated." "How do you know that?" "I've been taking EMT classes. At night school." She looked up to find him watching her with an expression she couldn't read. "I want to be a nurse someday." Something shifted in his face. The anger drained away, replaced by what might have been curiosity. "A nurse? My grandmother raised me after my parents died. She got sick when I was 17, cancer. I spent a lot of time in hospitals, watching the nurses work. They were." She paused, searching for the right words. "They were the only ones who treated her like she mattered. Not like a charity case or a burden, but like a human being worth saving." Harrison was quiet for a long moment, still letting her hold his injured hand. The silence stretched between them, but it didn't feel uncomfortable, more like a held breath, a moment balanced on the edge of something important. "My mother was a nurse," he said finally, so quietly she almost missed it. "Was?" His jaw tightened, and she saw him retreat back behind his walls. "She died when I was 8. Car accident." The words hung in the air like an apology. Suddenly, so many things made sense. The impossible standards, the need for control, the way he seemed to test everyone who entered his life until they inevitably disappointed him and left. "I'm sorry," Amara said, meaning it. "Don't." The ice was back in his voice, but it sounded forced now, like armor that no longer fit properly. "I don't need your pity." "It's not pity. It's understanding." He pulled his hand away from hers, the spell broken. But as he turned to call Mrs. Caldwell to clean up the mess, Amara caught sight of the photograph on his desk. The one that had been face down every other time she'd seen it. It showed a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, wearing scrubs and holding a young boy with Harrison's grey eyes and stubborn chin. Both of them were laughing, caught in a moment of pure joy that seemed to mock the cold perfection of the room around them. As Mrs. Caldwell bustled in with cleaning supplies and first aid materials, Harrison quickly turned the photograph face down again. But it was too late. Amara had seen the truth that lived beneath his icy exterior. A little boy who'd lost his mother and spent the rest of his life making sure no one could hurt him that badly again. The question was, what was she going to do with that knowledge? As she helped Mrs. Caldwell clean up the broken glass, carefully avoiding the still damp patches of whiskey, Amara made a decision. Harrison Whitmore might think he was impossible to please, but she'd faced impossible odds before. She'd survived losing her parents, watching her grandmother die, and clawing her way up from poverty with nothing but determination and hope. One broken billionaire couldn't be harder than all of that. Could he? The morning after the crystal incident, Amara approached Harrison's study with her usual breakfast service, but everything felt different. The air seemed charged with the memory of his vulnerability. The way his voice had softened when he mentioned his mother, the careful way she'd bandaged his hand, the photograph that revealed the boy he'd once been. She knocked softly before entering, a habit she'd developed despite Mrs. Caldwell's insistence that such formalities were unnecessary. When his voice called for her to enter, she noticed something she'd never heard before: uncertainty. Harrison sat behind his massive desk, his injured hand resting carefully on its surface. He'd wrapped it professionally, she noted with approval, and the angry tension that usually radiated from him seemed muted, like a fire banked but not extinguished. "Your coffee, sir," she said, setting the cup at precisely 175 degrees in its usual spot. "How is your hand this morning?" "Fine." The word came out clipped, automatic. Then, after a pause that lasted a heartbeat too long, "Thank you. For yesterday." The admission seemed to cost him something. Amara felt a flutter of something dangerous in her chest. Not quite sympathy, but something warmer and more complex. She'd seen behind his mask, and now every interaction carried the weight of that knowledge. "You don't need to thank me for basic human decency," she replied, arranging his newspapers with the same precision Mrs. Caldwell had drilled into her. "That's just what people do." "Is it?" His grey eyes fixed on her with that familiar intensity, but something had changed in their depths. "In my experience, people do what benefits them. Everything else is just performance." There was a bitterness in his voice that made her pause in her newspaper arrangement. She thought of her grandmother, who'd shared her last $20 with a homeless veteran despite having cancer treatments to pay for. Of Maria in the kitchen, who'd quietly left extra food in Amara's quarters when she thought no one was looking. Of the nurse who'd stayed late to braid her grandmother's hair before she lost it to chemotherapy, just because it made her smile. "Then you've been meeting the wrong people," Amara said simply. Harrison's eyebrows rose, that same fractional movement she'd noticed during their first confrontation. "And I suppose you're different? I suppose we're all just trying to survive our own particular kinds of pain." The words hung between them like a bridge neither had expected to build. Harrison's hand stilled on his tablet, and for a moment, the morning light streaming through the windows caught the silver in his eyes, making them seem less like steel and more like storm clouds about to break. "That's a very," he seemed to search for the right word, "optimistic way of looking at it." "Optimism is just hope with a work ethic," Amara replied, echoing something her grandmother used to say. "Without it, what's the point of getting up in the morning?" Something flickered across his face, too quick to identify, but it looked almost like longing. Then his mask slipped back into place, though it seemed to fit less securely than before. "You may go," he said, but his voice lacked its usual dismissive edge. As Amara reached the door, his voice stopped her. "Miss Washington?" "Yes, sir?" "The flowers in my study. Yesterday's arrangement was—" He paused, as if the words were foreign to his tongue. "Adequate." High praise, coming from Harrison Whitmore. Amara felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the compliment, and everything to do with the way he'd struggled to give it. "Thank you, sir. I'll keep that in mind." Over the following days, their interactions developed a careful rhythm, a dance of advancement and retreat that neither acknowledged but both participated in. Harrison's criticisms became less cutting, his expectations marginally more reasonable. He still demanded perfection, but now he occasionally explained the reasoning behind his requests instead of expecting her to read his mind. Amara, for her part, found herself paying closer attention to details that had nothing to do with her job description. The way his shoulders tensed when his phone rang with calls from his father, the legendary patriarch of Whitmore Holdings who, according to gossip, had never met an emotion he couldn't monetize. The preference for Earl Grey tea at exactly 4 p.m., though he never actually finished the cup. The way he unconsciously rubbed his temples when reviewing quarterly reports, as if the numbers caused him physical pain. She began to anticipate his needs before he voiced them. Fresh flowers in his study every Monday, because the weekend arrangements always wilted by then. Extra logs for his fireplace when the weather turned cold, because he preferred the warmth of real flames to central heating. Lunch served 15 minutes later on Thursdays, when his standing conference call with Tokyo always ran long. "You're different from the others," Mrs. Caldwell observed one afternoon as they reviewed the weekly household schedule. The older woman's sharp eyes missed nothing, and Amara had the uncomfortable feeling of being studied under a microscope. "Different how?" "You watch him. Not like the others. They were afraid of him, or attracted to his money, or both. You watch him like you're trying to solve a puzzle." Amara kept her expression carefully neutral. "He's my employer. It's important to understand what he needs." Mrs. Caldwell's tone suggested she wasn't buying the deflection. "Just remember, dear, puzzles are meant to be solved from the outside. Getting too close to the pieces makes it impossible to see the bigger picture." The warning was clear, but Amara found herself ignoring it. Because the more she watched Harrison Whitmore, the more she saw the cracks in his perfect facade. And cracks, she'd learned from years of living in poverty, were where the light got in. Do you think Amara is making a mistake by getting emotionally invested in her employer? Have you ever found yourself caring about someone who seemed untouchable? Share your thoughts below. The turning point came on a grey Thursday afternoon when Harrison summoned her to his study with unusual urgency. She found him standing before the tall windows, his posture rigid with controlled tension. "Pack a bag," he said without preamble. "We're traveling to New York. Tonight." "Sir, there's a situation with the Manhattan project, the hotel acquisition I've been working on for 6 months. The primary investor is having second thoughts, and if I don't salvage this deal personally, Whitmore Holdings stands to lose $12 million. Amara tried to process the implications. "How long will we be gone?" 3 days. For at most." He turned from the window, and she was struck by the exhaustion in his features. "I need someone I can trust to handle the details. Mrs. Caldwell has arthritis. Travel is difficult for her. Maria doesn't speak enough English for business situations. That leaves you. Trust." The word hung in the air between them, loaded with implications neither wanted to examine too closely. In the month she'd worked for him, Harrison had never indicated that he trusted anyone with anything more significant than his morning coffee. "What would you need me to do?" "Administrative support. Note-taking during meetings. Coordination with hotel staff and business associates. Think of yourself as my personal assistant." The title seemed to stick in his throat slightly. "Can you handle that?" "Yes, sir. The work will be demanding. Long hours, high-pressure situations. Some of the people we'll be dealing with are—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Not particularly refined in their business practices. If you're uncomfortable with confrontational negotiations—" "Mr. Whitmore," Amara interrupted, earning one of his now familiar eyebrow raises. "I've been poor my entire life. I've dealt with landlords, bill collectors, and emergency room staff who looked at my insurance card like it was contaminated. I think I can handle a few rude businessmen." Something that might have been a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Pack business attire. We leave at 8. But as Amara hurried to her quarters to prepare for the unexpected trip, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a business emergency. Harrison Whitmore was a man who controlled every aspect of his environment with obsessive precision. He didn't make impulsive decisions or trust strangers with important responsibilities. So why was he taking her to New York? And more importantly, what was she walking into? The private jet was an exercise in understated luxury. Cream leather seats, polished wood accents, and a level of quiet that seemed to absorb sound itself. Amara had never flown before, let alone in anything more extravagant than the Greyhound buses that had carried her between jobs and apartments. She tried not to gawk at the amenities, but Harrison noticed her wide-eyed appreciation anyway. "First time flying?" he asked as the plane reached cruising altitude. "First time leaving Virginia, actually." The admission slipped out before she could stop it, and she immediately regretted revealing another piece of her limited world. But instead of the condescension she expected, Harrison looked genuinely surprised. "Really? Never? Hard to travel when you're working 3 jobs just to keep a roof over your head." She kept her tone matter-of-fact, refusing to make it sound like a plea for sympathy. Harrison was quiet for a long moment, staring out the small window at the lights of cities passing below. When he spoke again, his voice carried a strange note she couldn't identify. My mother used to say that travel was the only education that mattered. That you couldn't really understand people until you'd seen how they lived in different places. She sounds like she was wise. She was. His reflection in the window looked younger, more vulnerable. She would have liked New York. All that energy, all those people with stories to tell. Amara felt like she was watching him remember something precious and painful. What would she think of what you've built? The business empire, this lifestyle? The question seemed to catch him off guard. He turned from the window to look at her directly, and for a moment, his mask slipped completely. I don't know, he said quietly. I've spent so many years building what I thought she would want me to have: security, success, enough money to solve any problem. But lately, I wonder if I've built a prison instead of a palace. The honesty in his voice made something ache in Amara's chest. Here was Harrison Whitmore, the Ice King of Virginia, the man who made corporations tremble, admitting that he might have lost his way. The vulnerability was devastating and beautiful, like watching a glacier crack in the spring sun. It's not too late, she said softly. To build something different, I mean. Something she would have been proud of. Isn't it? His grey eyes searched her face, as if looking for an answer to a question he'd been afraid to ask. How do you know when you've gone too far down the wrong path to find your way back? You don't, Amara replied, thinking of her own journey from the trailer park to his estate, all the wrong turns and dead ends that had led her to this moment. You just have to trust that every step, even the wrong ones, taught you something you needed to know. Outside the window, the lights of New York City began to emerge from the darkness, like a galaxy spread across the earth. In a few hours, they would land in a world where Harrison Whitmore was known as a ruthless dealmaker, where showing weakness could cost millions and trusting the wrong person could destroy everything he'd built. But here, suspended between earth and sky in the quiet luxury of the cabin, he was just a man who missed his mother and wondered if he'd become someone she would recognize. And Amara Washington, who'd taken a job that everyone else had rejected, was beginning to understand that sometimes the most dangerous thing you could do was see the humanity in someone who'd forgotten they had any left. The plane began its descent toward Manhattan, carrying them both toward a test neither had expected and a choice that would change everything. The Four Seasons Hotel in Manhattan was a symphony of marble and gold, its lobby bustling with the kind of people who wore their wealth like armor. Amara felt underdressed despite her best efforts. The black blazer and pencil skirt she'd bought at a discount store suddenly seemed painfully obvious next to the designer outfits that swept past her like expensive ghosts. Harrison, by contrast, moved through the space like he owned it. His charcoal suit was perfectly tailored, his stride confident and purposeful. But Amara had learned to read the subtle signs of his stress, the way his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the careful control in his movements that suggested a man holding something volatile in check. The meeting is at 9 a.m., he explained as they rode the elevator to the penthouse suite he'd reserved. Viktor Kozlov, the primary investor, is bringing his entire legal team. This isn't just about money anymore. He's questioning the fundamental viability of the project. What changed his mind? Harrison's reflection in the polished elevator doors looked grim. Someone's been feeding him information. Selective information designed to make our proposal look unstable. The question is who and why. The penthouse suite was larger than most apartments, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking view of Central Park. Harrison immediately moved to the desk and began spreading out documents, architectural plans, financial projections, legal contracts that seemed to multiply like paper rabbits. I need you to review these, he said, his voice taking on the clipped efficiency she recognized from high-stress situations. Look for anything that could be interpreted as a weakness or inconsistency. Fresh eyes sometimes catch what we've missed. Amara settled into the work with the same determination she'd applied to her EMT studies. The numbers told a story of careful planning and conservative projections. Harrison's proposed hotel renovation was actually less risky than she'd expected, designed to preserve the historic character of the building while modernizing its infrastructure. "This looks solid to me," she said after an hour of careful review. "Your profit margins are conservative, the timeline is realistic, and you've built in contingencies for cost overruns. What exactly is Kozlov concerned about?" "That's what we need to find out tomorrow." Harrison loosened his tie, the first time she'd seen him make such a casual gesture. "In the meantime, we prepare for every possible objection." They worked until nearly midnight, Harrison explaining the intricacies of commercial real estate, while Amara took notes and asked questions that forced him to clarify his reasoning. She found herself impressed by the depth of his knowledge and the genuine passion he showed for preserving historic architecture. This wasn't just about profit, it was about creating something beautiful and lasting. "You could have been a teacher," she observed during a brief break, watching him sketch out building modifications with careful precision. "A teacher?" The idea seemed to amuse him. "I don't have the patience for it. You've been teaching me all evening. And you're good at it. You explain things clearly. You don't make me feel stupid for asking questions." Harrison looked up from his sketches, something shifting in his expression. "You don't ask stupid questions. You ask the right questions. The ones that force me to think more clearly about what I'm trying to accomplish." There was something in his voice that made her pulse quicken. Not the professional appreciation of an employer for competent help, but something warmer and more personal. The space between them seemed to contract, charged with an awareness that had been building for weeks. "We should get some rest," Harrison said, his voice slightly rougher than usual. "Tomorrow will be challenging." But as Amara gathered her notes and prepared to retire to her adjoining room, she caught him watching her with an expression that made her breath catch. For just a moment, the careful distance he maintained seemed to waver, and she glimpsed something in his grey eyes that looked almost like longing. The boardroom on the 42nd floor was designed to intimidate. Black granite table, leather chairs that probably cost more than Amara's yearly salary, and windows that offered a commanding view of the city sprawling below. Viktor Kozlov arrived with an entourage that included 3 lawyers, 2 accountants, and a consulting firm representative who looked like he'd stepped out of a men's fashion magazine. Kozlov himself was a bear of a man with silver hair and eyes like chips of ice. He dominated the room not through volume, but through presence. The kind of man who was accustomed to having his opinions treated as facts. "Harrison," he said, his accent carrying just a trace of Eastern European inflection, "I trust you've had time to reconsider your position." "My position hasn't changed, Victor. The Meridian Hotel represents an exceptional opportunity to create something extraordinary while generating substantial returns. Substantial returns based on questionable projections." Kozlov gestured to his legal team, who began spreading their own documents across the table like a paper army. "My consultants have identified several concerning factors that weren't adequately addressed in your initial proposal." Amara sat slightly behind Harrison, notebook ready, watching the proceedings with the intensity of someone who understood that careers could be made or destroyed in rooms like this. She'd seen corporate negotiations portrayed in movies, but the reality was more subtle. A chess game played with careful words and strategic silences. Such as, Harrison's voice remained perfectly controlled, but Amara noticed the way his hand tightened almost imperceptibly on his pen. Market saturation in the luxury hotel sector. Rising construction costs due to supply chain disruptions. Questions about the structural integrity of a building that dates to 1924. Kozlov's smile was sharp as a blade. "These are not trivial concerns, my friend." For the next hour, Harrison systematically dismantled each objection with facts, figures, and architectural reports. He was brilliant, calm under pressure, thorough in his responses, persuasive without being aggressive. But Amara could see that Kozlov wasn't really listening. The investor had made up his mind before he'd entered the room. "You present a compelling case," Kozlov said finally. "But I'm afraid my concerns remain unaddressed." "What would it take to address them?" Harrison asked. "A fundamental restructuring of the partnership terms. Reduced timeline commitments. Additional guarantees against cost overruns. Kozlov leaned back in his chair with the satisfaction of a man delivering a killing blow. Essentially, I want you to absorb the majority of the risk while maintaining my percentage of the profits. The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. Amara felt her heart sink as she watched Harrison's face. He was too experienced to show shock, but she could see the defeat in the careful stillness of his features. Those terms would make the project financially unviable, Harrison said quietly. Then perhaps it's time to consider that this particular project isn't meant to be. Kozlov was already reaching for his briefcase when Amara surprised herself by speaking. "Mr. Kozlov," she said, her voice clear and confident despite the way her heart was hammering against her ribs. "May I ask you something?" Every head in the room turned toward her. Harrison's eyebrows rose in what might have been alarm or curiosity. Kozlov looked like a man who'd been interrupted by a piece of furniture. "And you are?" Kozlov's tone could have frozen champagne. "Amara Washington, Mr. Whitmore's assistant." She stood up, moving to the presentation board where Harrison's architectural plans were displayed. "I'm not a businesswoman, so maybe I'm missing something obvious. But it seems to me that your concerns are based on assumptions that don't match the reality of this project. Is that so?" Kozlov's voice carried dangerous amusement. "Yes, sir." Amara pointed to the structural engineering reports. "You mentioned concerns about the building's age, but these reports show that the original construction was actually overbuilt by 1920s standards. The steel frame could support twice the load we're planning to add." She moved to the financial projections, her confidence growing as she found her rhythm. "As for market saturation, you're thinking of this as a luxury hotel competing with the Plaza or the St. Regis. But Mr. Whitmore's concept is different. He's creating a boutique experience that preserves the building's historic character while offering modern amenities. There's nothing like it in Manhattan." "Young lady," Kozlov began, but Amara was warming to her theme. "The comparable properties you're using for your market analysis are all modern constructions. But travelers are increasingly interested in authentic experiences, not just luxury for its own sake. This building has stories to tell. Al Capone once owned the penthouse. Hemingway wrote part of The Sun also rises in the bar. You can't manufacture that kind of authenticity." She turned back to face the room, meeting Kozlov's startled gaze directly. "With respect, sir, I think you're not seeing the forest for the trees. This isn't just a real estate investment. It's a piece of American history that deserves to be preserved. And it's also going to make everyone in this room a great deal of money." The silence that followed was different from the earlier tension, charged with surprise and something that might have been grudging respect. Harrison was staring at her like she'd just performed magic, while Kozlov's expression had shifted from dismissive to thoughtful. "Interesting perspective," Kozlov said finally. "Tell me, Miss Washington, how long have you been working in commercial real estate?" "About 3 hours," Amara replied honestly. "But I've been working my whole life, and I know the difference between a solid opportunity and a pipe dream. This is solid." One of Kozlov's lawyers whispered something in his ear. The investor nodded slowly, his ice-chip eyes fixed on Amara with new interest. "You have an unusual assistant, Harrison," he said. "One who apparently believes in your vision more than my consultants believe in their own analysis. She has a gift for seeing the essential truth in complicated situations," Harrison replied, his voice carrying a warmth that made Amara's cheeks flush. Kozlov was quiet for a long moment, studying the documents spread across the table with fresh eyes. When he looked up, his expression had shifted subtly. "I'll need to discuss this with my team," he said. "But perhaps we've been overly focused on potential problems instead of probable opportunities. Does that mean you're reconsidering your position?" Harrison asked carefully. "It means I'm willing to continue the conversation. My lawyers will be in touch about revised terms that reflect a more balanced approach to risk and reward." As Kozlov and his entourage filed out of the boardroom, Harrison stood frozen at the window, staring out at the Manhattan skyline. Amara began gathering the scattered documents, unsure whether she'd just saved the deal or made everything worse by overstepping her boundaries. "Did I just destroy your business relationship?" she asked quietly. Harrison turned from the window, and the expression on his face took her breath away. Gone was the careful control, the professional distance, the icy composure that had defined him since their first meeting. In its place was something raw and real and beautiful, gratitude, admiration, and something deeper that made her pulse race. "You were magnificent," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Absolutely magnificent." They stood alone in the boardroom as the afternoon sun slanted through the windows, turning the space golden and intimate. Harrison moved closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of silver in his grey eyes, close enough to catch the faint scent of his cologne. "Why did you do that?" he asked. "You could have stayed silent, let me handle it. Instead, you put yourself on the line for a project that has nothing to do with you." "It has everything to do with me," Amara replied, surprised by the intensity in her own voice. "I've watched you work on this for weeks. I've seen how much it means to you, not just the money, but the chance to create something beautiful. When Kozlov was dismissing all of that, I couldn't just sit there and watch." "But why?" Harrison's voice was barely above a whisper. "Why do you care what happens to me?" The question hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Amara felt the weight of the moment, the understanding that her answer would change everything, that there would be no going back to the careful professional distance they'd maintained. "Because," she said, her voice steady despite the way her heart was racing, "you're not the man you pretend to be. You're not cold or ruthless or impossible to please. You're just someone who's been hurt so badly that you've forgotten how to trust people. And I think I'm falling in love with who you really are." The admission hung in the air like a confession, beautiful and terrifying in its honesty. Harrison's face went through a dozen expressions: shock, fear, longing, and something that looked almost like grief. "Amara," he said, her name a prayer and a warning. "You don't understand. I'm not. I can't be what you need. I don't know how to be soft or gentle, or any of the things you deserve. I turn everything I touch to ice." "No," she said firmly, stepping closer until there were only inches between them. "You create beautiful things. You preserve history. You protected me from Kozlov's lawyers when you could have just let me embarrass myself. You're not made of ice, Harrison. You're just afraid of melting." For a moment, she thought he might kiss her, saw the desire flicker in his eyes, felt the tension that pulled between them like a magnetic field. But then his walls slammed back into place, and he stepped away with the careful control she knew so well. "This is impossible," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "You work for me. The complications alone. Are you firing me?" The question stopped him cold. "What? Are you firing me? Because if you're not, then I don't work for you. I work with you. There's a difference." Harrison stared at her for a long moment, and she could almost see the war being fought behind his eyes. Fear battling hope, control wrestling with desire, the man he'd become struggling against the boy he'd once been. When his phone rang, they both jumped like guilty teenagers. Harrison answered with his usual crisp professionalism, but Amara noticed the way his hand trembled slightly as he held the device. "Kozlov," he said after ending the call. "He wants to meet tonight. Says he has a revised proposal. That's good news, isn't it?" "It should be." Harrison looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. "But right now, all I can think about is what you said. About falling in love with who I really am." "Harrison, I haven't been that person in a very long time, Amara. I'm not sure I remember how." The vulnerability in his voice broke something open in her chest, a flood of tenderness and determination that surprised her with its intensity. "Then maybe," she said softly, "it's time to figure it out. Have you ever taken a risk to defend someone you cared about, even when it could have backfired? What do you think Harrison's next move should be? Share your thoughts below." As they prepared to leave the boardroom, Amara caught their reflection in the dark window. Two people standing at the edge of something that could either save them both or destroy everything they'd built. The city sprawled below them like a promise and a threat, full of possibilities they were only beginning to imagine. Tomorrow, they would have to face the consequences of this moment. The changed dynamic between them, the questions that couldn't be unasked, the feelings that had been acknowledged and couldn't be taken back. But tonight, in the golden light of a Manhattan afternoon, anything seemed possible. even love, even redemption, even the sweetest days of their lives. The restaurant Kozlov had chosen for dinner was the kind of place where reservations were made months in advance, and the waitstaff moved with the quiet efficiency of dancers. Amara felt underdressed again, despite Harrison's assurance that her simple black dress was perfect. But as they were seated at a table overlooking the glittering expanse of Central Park, she realized that her nerves had nothing to do with the setting and everything to do with the man sitting across from her. The confession in the boardroom hung between them like a question mark. Harrison had been polite, professional, even warm during the taxi ride to the restaurant. But the careful distance was back, and Amara couldn't tell if it was protection or rejection. Kozlov arrived precisely on time, alone except for a single attorney who looked more like a bodyguard than a legal advisor. The investor seemed different from the morning, more relaxed, almost jovial as he settled into his chair. "I've been thinking about your presentation today," he said without preamble, his eyes fixed on Amara with obvious curiosity. "Particularly your assistant's passionate defense of the project." "Miss Washington has a unique perspective," Harrison replied carefully. "Indeed." Kozlov smiled, but there was steel beneath the charm. "It made me realize that perhaps I've been approaching this opportunity with too much caution. Sometimes the best investments are the ones that inspire passion, not just profit." He reached into his briefcase and withdrew a folder thick with documents. "I have a revised proposal. Terms that I believe will be more acceptable to both parties." The next hour was a masterclass in negotiation. Kozlov had indeed restructured the deal, but in Harrison's favor: increased funding, more reasonable timeline expectations, and profit-sharing terms that reflected a true partnership rather than one-sided risk management. "What changed your mind?" Harrison asked as they reviewed the final details. Kozlov's smile became genuine. "Your assistant reminded me why I started investing in real estate in the first place. It wasn't just about money. It was about creating something lasting, something that would outlive me. The Meridian Hotel project has that potential." As the contracts were signed and hands were shaken, Amara felt a complex mix of emotions. Pride in Harrison's success, satisfaction in her small role in securing it, but underneath, a growing anxiety about what this meant for them. With the business crisis resolved, what excuse did they have to maintain the intimacy that had developed between them? "We should celebrate," Kozlov declared, signaling for champagne. "To the Meridian Hotel, and to passionate advocates who remind us why we fell in love with beautiful buildings in the first place." The toast was made, the champagne was drunk, and plans were discussed for the next phase of the project. But all Amara could think about was the way Harrison's eyes kept finding hers across the table, the careful way he avoided touching her when he passed her documents, the tension that seemed to coil tighter with each passing moment. The reckoning. They walked back to the hotel in silence, the autumn air crisp with the promise of winter. Manhattan pulsed around them, taxis honking, people streaming past in urgent rivers of ambition and desire. But Amara felt isolated in a bubble of uncertainty. In the elevator up to their suite, Harrison finally spoke. "You saved the deal today. You know that, don't you? We saved it. Together." "No." He turned to face her fully, and she was startled by the intensity in his grey eyes. "You did something I couldn't. You made Kozlov see the heart of the project instead of just the numbers. You have a gift, Amara, the ability to find the human truth in any situation." The elevator opened at their floor, but neither moved to exit. "Harrison," she began, but he held up a hand. "Let me finish. Please." His voice was rough with emotion. "What you said earlier, about falling in love with who I really am, I need you to understand something. I haven't been that person in so long that I wasn't sure he still existed. But you, God, Amara, you look at me and somehow see past all the walls I've built. You see someone worth caring about. Because you are worth caring about. Am I?" The question came out like a confession. "I've spent 15 years building an empire, accumulating wealth and power, proving to the world that I'm untouchable. But what's the point of being untouchable if it means being untouched?" The elevator doors began to close, but Harrison stopped them with his hand. In the fluorescent light of the small space, his face looked younger, more vulnerable than she'd ever seen it. "I'm scared, Amara. Terrified, actually. I don't know how to be in love. I don't know how to trust someone with the parts of myself that I've kept locked away. Every instinct I have tells me to run, to push you away before you can hurt me. But the thought of losing you scares me more than the thought of being hurt." He stepped closer, close enough that she could see her reflection in his eyes. "You asked me earlier if I was firing you. I couldn't, even if I wanted to. Not because you work for me, but because I can't imagine my life without you in it." The confession hung between them like a bridge finally completed after years of construction. Amara felt tears prick at her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of finally hearing the words she'd hoped for, but hadn't dared to expect. "So what do we do now?" she whispered. "Now," Harrison said, his hand rising to cup her cheek with infinite tenderness. "We figure it out together. All of it. The complications, the logistics, the fact that my father is going to have apoplexy when he finds out I'm in love with someone who calls him out on his nonsense." "Your father?" "Another conversation for another day." Harrison's thumb traced the line of her cheekbone, and Amara felt her knees go weak. "Right now, all I care about is this moment. You, me, and the fact that somehow, against all odds, you've managed to melt the ice around my heart." When he kissed her, it was with the desperate tenderness of a man who'd been drowning and finally found something to hold on to. Amara melted into him, tasting champagne and possibility on his lips, feeling the careful control he'd maintained for so long finally crumble into something real and warm and human. They barely made it to the suite before the careful distance they'd maintained exploded into something urgent and necessary. But beneath the passion was something deeper, a recognition, a homecoming, the sense that two people who'd been lost had finally found their way to each other. 6 months later, the morning sun streamed through the windows of the renovated Meridian Hotel as Amara hurried through the lobby, her nursing school textbooks clutched in one arm and her hospital ID badge clipped to her scrubs. The hotel's grand reopening was still 3 months away, but the lobby already gleamed with restored Art Deco glory. Marble floors polished to mirror brightness, brass fixtures that caught and reflected light like captured sunshine. "Late again, Miss Washington," called a familiar voice, warm with affection and gentle teasing. Amara turned to find Harrison emerging from what would soon be the hotel's signature restaurant, his sleeves rolled up and his expensive tie loosened. Even after 6 months together, the sight of him still made her pulse quicken, but now it was tempered with the deep contentment of knowing he was hers, walls down, heart open. "Clinical rotation starts in 30 minutes, she replied, but she couldn't help smiling as he crossed the lobby toward her. "Some of us have medical careers to worry about. Some of us also have boyfriends who worry when they don't get their good morning kiss," Harrison replied, pulling her into his arms despite the fact that they were standing in the middle of a construction zone. "Careful," Amara laughed. "Mrs. Caldwell might see and start making disapproving noises again." "Mrs. Caldwell has been making disapproving noises for months. I think she secretly likes having something to complain about." The kiss was brief but thorough, tasting of coffee and the promise of evening plans. When they separated, Harrison's hands lingered on her waist, his grey eyes soft with the kind of contentment she'd never thought she'd see there. "How's the pediatric rotation going?" he asked, genuine interest brightening his features. "Terrifying and wonderful, and exactly what I'm supposed to be doing." Amara's face lit up with the enthusiasm that still surprised her with its intensity. "Yesterday I helped deliver medication to a little girl who'd been scared of needles. By the end of my shift, she was teaching me origami. Sounds like she learned from the best teacher." "About overcoming fear?" Amara raised an eyebrow. "I learned that from an expert." Harrison's smile was soft and self-deprecating. "I'm still learning. Every day." It was true. The man who'd once controlled every aspect of his environment with obsessive precision had learned to live with uncertainty, to find joy in spontaneity, to trust that love didn't always follow a business plan. It hadn't been easy. There had been arguments, misunderstandings, moments when old patterns threatened to reassert themselves. But they'd worked through each challenge together, building something stronger than either had thought possible. "Dinner tonight?" Harrison asked, though they both knew the answer. "Your place or mine?" It was a running joke. Amara had moved into the main house months ago, but she still maintained the fiction of having her own space. "Ours," Harrison corrected, and the words still sent warmth through her chest. The sweetest days. That evening, Amara found Harrison in his study. Their study now, with her nursing textbooks sharing shelf space with his business journals, and her grandmother's quilt draped over the leather reading chair. He was bent over architectural plans for the hotel's final phase, but he looked up immediately when she entered. "How was the hospital?" he asked, pushing back from the desk to give her his full attention. "Exhausting. Wonderful. I think I'm getting the hang of 4 insertions, but pediatric dosage calculations are still kicking my butt." She settled into his lap, still marveling at how natural the gesture had become. "How was your day? Any crises that required my intervention?" "Just one." Harrison's arms tightened around her, and she could feel him smile against her hair. "I couldn't figure out how to properly celebrate." "Celebrate what?" "This." He reached across the desk and picked up an official-looking letter. Kozlov's investment group just approved funding for the second phase. The Meridian Hotel project is officially expanding to include the building next door. Amara shrieked with delight, nearly knocking over his coffee cup in her enthusiasm. "Harrison, that's amazing. This is what you've been working toward for months." "We've been working toward," he corrected. "None of this would have happened without you. Your presentation to Kozlov, your insights during the planning phases, your ability to see possibilities that I was too focused to notice. What's the most important lesson you think Amara and Harrison learned from each other? Have you ever experienced a relationship that changed who you fundamentally are? Share your thoughts about transformation through love below. What I did was believe in you. The vision, the passion, the man who cared more about preserving history than just making money. That was all you. Maybe. But you helped me remember who that man was." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the estate grounds. The gardens were in full spring bloom, roses and lavender, creating a tapestry of color that would have made the house's original owners proud. In the distance, construction crews were putting the finishing touches on the hotel's exterior, restoring the building to its 1920s glory while equipping it for modern luxury. "I've been thinking," Harrison said eventually, his voice carrying a note of carefully controlled nervousness that she'd learned to recognize. About us. About the future." He shifted slightly, reaching into his jacket pocket. "About the fact that I can't imagine spending another day without you, let alone a lifetime." Amara's breath caught as he withdrew a small velvet box, its edges worn as if it had been carried around for some time. "This was my mother's," he said, opening the box to reveal a simple platinum band set with a single, perfect diamond. "She always said that the right ring would know its person when the time came." "Harrison, I know we haven't been together very long by conventional standards. I know you're just starting nursing school and have a career to build. I know there are 1,000 practical reasons to wait." His grey eyes were bright with emotion, all pretense of control abandoned. "But I also know that loving you has made me more myself than I've been in 20 years. And I know that whatever challenges we face, I want to face them with you." The proposal was everything she could have dreamed of, heartfelt, honest, acknowledging both their realities and their possibilities. But more than that, it was proof of how far they'd both traveled from that first morning when she'd stood trembling in his morning room, desperate for any chance at a better life. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, with the confidence of a woman who'd learned to trust her own heart. "Yes, absolutely yes." The ring fit perfectly, catching the lamplight like captured stars. As Harrison slipped it onto her finger, Amara thought about the job posting that had brought her here. The position that everyone else had rejected, the opportunity that had seemed too good to be true. She'd taken a job at the cold Billionaire'S house expecting to survive. Instead, she'd learned to live. 1 year later, the grand reopening of the Meridian Hotel was everything Harrison had envisioned and more. The restored lobby buzzed with guests and media, the Art Deco fixtures gleaming under crystal chandeliers that had been painstakingly restored to their original glory. Jazz music floated from the bar where Hemingway had once written, and the entire building hummed with the kind of authentic elegance that couldn't be manufactured, only preserved and celebrated. Amara moved through the crowd in a midnight blue dress that Harrison had insisted on buying for the occasion, her engagement ring catching the light as she shook hands with investors and city officials. She'd graduated from nursing school 3 months earlier, and her new position at Children's Hospital meant she spent her days doing exactly what she'd dreamed of, caring for young patients with the same compassion her grandmother's nurses had shown. "Ladies and gentlemen," Harrison's voice carried clearly through the lobby as he called for attention. "Thank you all for joining us tonight to celebrate not just the reopening of the Meridian Hotel, but the preservation of a piece of American history." Amara watched from the crowd, her heart swelling with pride as he spoke about the careful restoration process, the teams of craftsmen who'd brought the building back to life, the vision of creating a place where past and present could coexist in harmony. "But most importantly," Harrison continued, his eyes finding hers across the room, "I want to thank the person who reminded me that the most beautiful buildings are made not of marble and steel, but of hope and determination and the courage to believe in something better." The applause was warm and genuine, but Amara barely heard it. All she could see was Harrison, walking toward her through the crowd with the kind of smile that still made her knees weak after all this time. "Dance with me?" he asked, extending his hand as the jazz trio began a slow, dreamy number. "Always," she replied, letting him lead her onto the small dance floor they'd carved out near the bar. As they swayed together, surrounded by the restored beauty of the hotel and the warm glow of their shared success, Amara thought about the scared, desperate woman who'd walked through those wrought-iron gates more than a year ago. She'd been looking for a job, a paycheck, a chance to survive another month. Instead, she'd found the love of her life, a career that fulfilled her soul, and proof that sometimes the most transformative opportunities came disguised as the chances that everyone else was too afraid to take. "Any regrets?" Harrison murmured against her ear as they danced. Amara looked around the glittering lobby, then up at the man who'd taught her that even the coldest hearts could learn to love again. "Just one," she said, smiling at his look of concern. "I regret that it took so long for everyone else to reject this job before it got to me." Harrison's laughter was rich and warm, carrying over the music and mixing with the happy chatter of their guests. As he spun her around the dance floor of the hotel they'd saved together, Amara Washington, soon to be Amara Whitmore, knew with absolute certainty that she was living the sweetest days of her life. And the best part? They were just getting started.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.